Mahalo for having me here today, and I'm going to be talking about the return of our Konohiki and looking at Kuleana in the sense of rights and responsibilities in balance. So just to give you a roadmap of what I'll be covering is, I'll be looking at Aina and Hawaiian identity, the origin and sources of Hawaiian customary law and their modern application, and reemergence of the Konohiki and the right to mālama. So a number of our speakers have been talking about Aina, and there's a very good passage that Dr. Beamer, Kamana Beamer, my colleague, shared with me from David Malo. And he talks about the difference between moku and Aina. And moku, the definition of a moku is an island that's surrounded by sea. But the word Aina means it has to be inhabited by people. And I think that is the fundamental understanding of Kanaka Maoli, that Aina is nothing without people, and that there is a reciprocal relationship. I got to see this slide from Dr. Maili Tawali'i, and she points to Kamehameha School's study in 2009 that talks about the integral relationship between Kanaka Maoli and the natural realm, and that there really is no difference. And they surveyed non-Hawaiian students and Maoli students, and they found that in the 60 and 80 percentiles, our Maoli students, Maoli youth had stated that the Aina is critical to their well-being, and when the Aina is injured, so are they. And that that the land is sacred, and that there is a responsibility to mālama. And one of the things that Bill Ayla, who's the chair of the Department of Land and Natural Resources, I heard him say, our resources are our ancestors. And I thought that is so true. And that is why we organize as Aloha Aina warriors, and we come together to protect our resources. And Uncle Walter Reedy, who's a staunch Aloha Aina warrior from Molokai, he talks about this GMO fight, and he said he didn't quite understand it until they tried to patent haloa. And he said that is the next mahele, the taking of our mana. And so I grew up as a child of the Aloha Aina movement. I was a child of the 70s, and I got to meet amazing kupuna like Auntie Clara Ku and Auntie Lani Kapuni, which was right next door to my grandmother's place. And I remember my father being part of Hui Ala Loa, and it was about opening up these trails that were fenced up by Molokai Ranch, and going along these ancient trails and protecting Kavakiu. That was one of the places in Kaluakoi and Kayaka on the west side. But also we could hear the bombing across from the channel, and that was the bombing of Kahoolawe. So that upper picture is looking from Molokai, and to the left is Maui, and to the right is Lanai, and in the middle is Kahoolawe. And we realized that we had Kuleana to Kahoolawe and to all of Hawaii. And that struggle still continues today. We've had the kind of public meetings we have on Molokai is there's 7,000 people on the island and 5,000 people show up for a hearing. So this was Save La'au on the west side. And then this was McAfee, the antivirus guy. We called him the virus instead, because he was trying to auction off an entire ahupua'a. And he brought the SWAT team from Honolulu to intimidate us. But one thing that Uncle Walter talks about is before sustainability, there was Aloha Aina. And when I look at sustainability, one of the things that people, they look at it as from a point of deficit. And it's understanding like what is the sustainable yield of an aquifer. It's how much you can take till you take your population to the brink of extinction until that resource is totally used up. But one of the things that my great-grandmother taught me was in her understanding of the resources out there. She was being interviewed by Tutu Pukui, and she was asked, hey, how's the fish in a fish pond? And she said, get so much fish, I can just kick with my feet, you know, there's so much, and I grab with my hand what I want to eat. And I thought, I can't even imagine that. But you know, one day I was coming home one night from my friend's wedding, and on Molokai it's pitch black, and you can be the only car on the road. And all I heard was this, like I was in the middle of a stadium, and this kind of sound. And it wasn't raining, so I'm like, what's going on? And then my headlights turned over this kupeke fish pond, and I saw fish by the thousands, like earthworms, just rattling and spawning. And it just flooded my senses. And in that moment, I realized that what my grandmother saw every day was that kind of abundance. And if you had that understanding of ʻāina, you wouldn't hoard. You wouldn't say, you would be so generous and hospitable, and you'd say, my, come eat, you know, and your world would encompass everyone. And so that understanding of ʻāina that feeds us and that nourishes us, and that we have this kuleana towards it, our kupuna understood that, and it's embedded within us. And it's so essential to our identity. And as an attorney, I was interested in, well, first of all, I was raised as an activist, so there was like no career choice was already chosen for me, so I had to go to law school. And you know, this is the place where I was raised, and it's Kamalo on the east side of Molokai. And I know every stone that you see here. This is the old Kamalo Wharf. And my father would take me and my brother out, and he would make us walk these stones. And he said, I'm giving you guys goat legs for hunting, and also for fishing, chase the crabs. And then there's these old, like, pilings of the old wharf. And I felt like he was making us walk the plank. And the water looked so deep, but now as an adult, it's like to my neck. And I'm like, why was I so terrified? You know, but as a kid, everything is in stereo, you know, it's all Dolby sound, everything is big. So this is the place where I learned how to gather clams when Hawaiian clams were still around. And I gathered crab. I went crabbing with my mother, got opai. And, you know, in those days, the Ohana didn't get the memo about child labor laws, so, you know, when I was, I remember from 5 years old, getting up at 5 in the morning and taking the boat out, pick up the net, you know, put the net back, put the fish in the cooler, go to school, come back from school, wait for the sun to almost go down, and back out there in the ocean and laying the net. And, you know, Tutu Pukui, she has this saying of the people in Ka'u, why they feel so connected to the land. It's because it's tied to their survival, and in that act of survival and hardship, they realize by that very nature, the land is so much more special to them. So my legs that has about 100 scars on them from pushing the boat while my dad had the easy job of passing the net down, my legs knows every piece of reef in that area from pushing that boat. So when I went to law school, I found out that there are unique laws that recognize Hawaiian practices, and they're really tied to that relationship we have to ʻāina. And these sources of law include Article 12, Section 7 of the Hawaii Constitution, and statutory law, HRS 7-1 and 1-1. So Hawaii Revised Statute 7-1 comes from the Kuleana Act of 1850, when during the time of the Mahele, when Hawaiian families were given their individual kuleana, their individual land parcel. And the king surmised that the land would be without value if the people weren't able to access the resources from Mauka to Makai. So he said, at minimum, the people should have a right to gather firewood, tea leaf, aho cord, thatch, and they should have right to free running water and drinking water and roam freely upon the roads. So this was codified eventually into state law. And then Hawaii Revised Statute 1-1 also came from the time of the kingdom. And it says, yes, we'll give credence to the common law of England and America. But when Hawaiian custom and usage says otherwise, Hawaiian custom and usage shall be the standard. And Article 12, Section 7 of the Hawaii State Constitution basically affirms these rights of native tenants, or Aloha Aina, to access these resources for their subsistence and for their cultural practices. So what does that mean in terms of judicial interpretation? So I had the privilege of meeting with Chief Justice Richardson before he passed away. He came to our class, and he was the first Native Hawaiian attorney and Chief Justice of the Hawaii Supreme Court. And he was looking at a case called Ashford, and it started actually in Kainalu on Molokai. And Ashford wanted to create his own private beach. And on his deed, it says, described his property as makekai, along the shoreline. And so he said, I'm gonna consult Hawaiian experts, and they're called kama'aina experts. So there's such thing in Hawaii called kama'aina expert testimony, and it's the wisdom and the knowledge and the ike of our kupuna that has just as much validity, if not more, than an expert that has a PhD attached to his or her name. And so they asked a simple question. Where did Hawaiians park their canoe? Did they park them where the wave could just wash them over and huli the canoe? That doesn't make sense. Well, of course, they would park the canoe where the naupaka is, where the waves couldn't hit. And therefore, all beaches in Hawaii are in the public domain. And no beach in Hawaii is owned privately. And they look to Hawaiian custom and usage in that respect. So where are Hawaiian access rights protected? They're protected on undeveloped land or less than fully developed land. They're protected within your ahupua'a, and if there are neighboring ahupua'a that you customarily accessed, like in the instance of the Pele Defense Fund case where Va'okeleo Puna was utilized by those from neighboring ahupua'a, then that will be seen as the custom and that will be protected. What is the state's obligation to Native Hawaiians? They cannot regulate these rights out of existence. And they must affirmatively protect these rights. And by doing so, they're supposed to make an independent assessment. So if a land use permit is being applied for, they have to independently assess what are the Hawaiian customary practices taking place in that area, and how can we feasibly protect them? And then they take action steps to do so. Now, what we're seeing now is an evolving of the law, I believe. So to date, there has been, to me, de minimis protection of Hawaiian rights. It's looking at access to different places. We at least must provide access to certain areas for these practices to be perpetuated. But as we've understood from our previous speakers, that also includes the right and the kuleana to mālama. And I believe what is happening is more and more our government agencies are coming into alignment in that understanding. So there's such things as the Hawaiian humpback whale sanctuary. They're now not just looking at the whale as one species, but looking at the whale within the ahupua'a and looking at those human relationships. We're looking at Papahanaumokuakea National Marine Monument, and it's supposed to be a co-management structure between scientists and Native Hawaiians. And then watershed partnerships is looking at public and private partnerships. And on Molokai, it's happening with the Hawaiian community. Right now, we're looking at the East Molokai Watershed Partnership. And we're utilizing what's called the Ahakiole structure with the community working with these large landowners and the state to look at access rights and traditional management. So where did this system come from? So according to the late Kumujan Ka'imikawa, he taught us what the Aha councils were about. And how he explains it is that it came from a period hundreds of years ago, even before the Ali'i system. And the threshold questions that were asked were, how can we make the resources abundant and the people thrive? And so in that understanding, they realized that they had to bring together those who were expert in different fields, whether it was in water management, whether it was in astronomy and understanding the weather patterns. And what he described it was an aha, and it's the fibers of the olona woven together, the expertise of all these konohiki woven together to create this strong rope, and that was the aha councils. And on Molokai, they were called the Ahakiole, the people's councils. And the kiole represented the iole, the shrouds of fish that blanketed the shoreline in a multitude of numbers, and that represented the people. And so they managed the system in accordance to moku and then to ahupua'a. And that was the mindset of our kupuna as they managed the resources. And he shared with me, Kumujan shared with me this thing, "Aya na kai po'olo'ulo o Molokai." And it's like the churning or the turbulent seas within the fish ponds, that it could be rough in the ponds because the fish were just so abundant, even though outside of the pond, the water was calm. The Hawaiian Kingdom codified these customary laws into the Konohiki fisheries, just with respect to fisheries. And it basically it recognized three classes of people: the Hawaiʻina, the people of the land, the Konohiki, and the king as sovereign. And it also recognized the ability of the Konohiki to kapu certain fish at certain periods to replenish the fish. But there were different laws that occurred during this transition to statehood and annexation that served to condemn the fisheries. But what essentially happened is these rights of the Hawaiʻina remain vested rights and have never been extinguished. So I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna go real fast. I'm doing my Native Hawaiian rights clinic in Kahana, and we're learning about the traditional practices of the Konohiki in Kahana band. We're trying to revitalize that, utilizing Hawaiian law to give the people a strategy for community-based management of their fishery. And we need Konohiki because our issues are of a global scale, not just affecting Native Hawaiians, but all of us. And I'd like to just show you my friend Malia Akutagawa. She's from Hanapepe, Kauai, and she talks about the salt making there, and that her family has practiced this for generations, but now sea level rise is covering their salt beds. So these things are affecting us in real time, and we need to have adaptive management, and that's what the Konohiki did. And luckily we have examples, and this is Uncle Mac Poi Poi, and he talks about Pono fishing. And these are the ways that he manages. He has his own mental map of shifts in the sand, and how that tells you whether the reef puka are full or empty, and that tells you when certain fish are spawning. He talks about having a code of conduct, being pono for our keiki, so letting the inshore water, saving them for the keiki and the kupuna, and the more expert divers go out. He looks at moon cycles and understands the seasons according to those moon cycles, and he knows when fish are spawning at certain times, and he sets kapu on those. And then he understands different behavior of fish. So the uhu, they travel in harems. So to spirit a male uhu means to take away their reproductive ability for at least a year. So it's important to mālama the male uhu. And looking at lobster, the ula takes 7 years to reach reproductive maturity. So if you spear a lobster before then, you take away and you steal from the next generations. Gathering limu, there's certain periods when there's minus tide. When it's minus tide during the daytime in the summer months, then you have dieback of limu. So you have to be aware of those things and conserve. You know, and don't maha oi in other ahupa'a. Stick in your own ahupa'a. You know, rotate the areas that you gather. Eat pono. Don't just eat the papio, you know. Eat the kole, eat the manini, eat different fish. And what we found with this Konohiki management was in comparable areas where no management was taking place, Mo'omomi showed greater fish biomass. You know, and why do we do it? We do it for the future generations. Mahalo.